Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to get it on. Get it on. Coming at you from a secret backwoods location in the middle of Texas. It's the highly opinionated and controversial voice of traditional old school Orthodox Christianity. This is Spiritual Combat with Dr. Scott Sullivan.
Hello, and welcome to Spiritual Combat, the show where we engage the enemy using prayer, fasting, and full contact logic on the front lines and in the trenches, inviting you to join the resistance against the forces of lies, error, and evil. I am your host, Scott Sullivan, and welcome to the show. All right, so I'm very happy to have a special guest on my show today. I'm talking with Dr. Michael Behe. Michael Behe is an American biochemist. He's an author of several books, one of which I'm holding right here in my hand, called Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution. Dr. Behe, he, like myself, is an advocate of intelligent design, and he has testified in several court cases related to intelligent design. He is also the professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania and a senior fellow of the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. So, Michael, hey, I just want to welcome you to the show here.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to be with you.
Thanks a lot. Now, listen here. There are a lot of people in my audience who may not have heard of you. They may not know who you are, Michael, and what you're all about and so on. So can you give us just kind of a little background on who you are and what you do, and really how you got started in this idea that we can recognize design in nature and biology and so on?
Sure. I'm a biochemist, and biochemists study the molecular basis of life, and I got my Ph.D. from the University of Pennsylvania a long time ago, and for a long time, I was just doing my own research. I didn't have any difficulties with the prevailing theory of evolution, Darwin's theory, because I didn't have anything to do with it, really. I was always kind of curious about it, but it was somebody else's concern. Reading my texts, one is always assured that science has answers for where things came from. But in the late 1980s, I read a book called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis by a geneticist and medical doctor by the name of Michael Denton. And in it, he raised a lot of problems for Darwin's theory of evolution that I had never heard of before. And after reading it, I got mad because I was thought that I had been led to believe something based not on the science or the facts, but because that's what we're supposed to believe these days. This is how we think now. And so after reading Denton's book, I became very interested in evolution. And in biochemistry, you study all sorts of very complex and elegant, sophisticated systems at the foundation of life. And every now and again, I had wondered, how the heck did these things evolve? And I kind of shrugged my shoulders and said, well, I guess somebody must know. And I went on to other things. But after reading Denton's book, I asked myself, well, who has explained these things? And I went to the science library and looked up in the journals and looked for papers that would explain some complex systems, and was really astonished to find there were nothing there. That in fact nobody knew. Not only did I not know, nobody knew. It was just everybody was kind of standing in a circle nodding their heads to each other that yeah, we understand how this happened. But no scientific work had shown how it could come about.
Now, Michael, let me just jump in here real quick. Now, are you saying, are you talking about the origin of life in particular, or just the different sorts of species? Exactly which part of this system or the process are you talking about here?
Okay, well, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because I'm a biochemist, so I'm interested in the molecular underpinnings of life. It's not just the origin of life, and it's not, my particular concern is not animals or plants or species, but it's what goes on inside the cell. And okay. It's a one of the kind of great advances of modern biology that science has discovered that life is based on machines, little tiny molecular machines that operate in the cell, that do things like replicate DNA and build all the structures in the cell and turn genes on and off, and all of these things are in fact machines, and extraordinarily complicated ones as well.
Right. Now, you got this picture in your book, and if anybody's listening and they haven't seen this, I think they need to Google it or something. But the main example you use is the bacterial flagellum, correct?
Yeah.
And that's a common example I've seen a lot. It just seems to me, just from a matter of common sense, anybody looking at sort of structure, especially if it were made out of different materials other than the materials that it's made out of now, would immediately infer design, without having any sort of a Ph.D. in biochemistry, just because of the ordered arrangement of the thing.
Yeah.
So is that what kind of got you thinking about this sort of thing?
Yeah, well, that and other things, but yeah, you're right that the picture of the bacterial flagellum, which for the audience, it's literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim, just like an outboard motor propels a motor boat in our everyday world. This propels it. This propels bacteria, and like an outboard motor, it's got a propeller, it's got a motor, it's got nuts and bolts to hold things together. It's a machine. And like you say, Scott, if anybody just looking at a drawing of this thing will recognize that it's a machine,
without a doubt. Yeah, right.
And that encapsulates both the problem for Darwinism, how such a thing could be put together, and the argument for intelligent design, because we see all of these parts of this machine ordered for its purpose, to act as this propeller for a bacterium. So, it's nice to have that, to take a look at something like that. It gets the idea across.
Yeah, I think so. Even for the more average person who hasn't spent a whole lot of time studying biochemistry, perhaps the picture is worth 1,000 words. I mean, anybody who looks at this, they would just, I think, from their common sense intuitions of how things come about, would just immediately intuit design. And
yes.
that'd be the normal common sense reaction, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. And you say to yourself, how do we intuit design? Well, it turns out we come to a conclusion of design when we see a number of parts that are put together to perform some function beyond the parts themselves. And in my book, the simple example I give is a mouse trap. It has different pieces, and all of them work together to catch a mouse. And if you look at that flagellum, you see the various parts of it, and you see that they're needed for the function. And it's not some religious conclusion. It's not some mystical conclusion. We come to conclusions of design all the time, and I think a big secret of modern science is how much the evidence we found at the basic level of life and even of physical nature points strongly to design.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because you hear this all the time, and it's just such a worn out, I think, accusation, Michael, that intelligent design, that's just a religious hypothesis. You're trying to go back to biblical six-day creationism, blah, blah, blah. That is not what intelligent design is. Can you kind of go over, maybe in a basic, kind of encapsulate a small definition or explanation of what intelligent design is in opposition to that sort of misconception?
Sure. It's actually, if you look up design in a dictionary, it's one of the definitions. It's got a number of definitions, but the pertinent definition is the purposeful arrangement of parts. And like I just said, if you see physical things kind of put together in a purposeful way, we always conclude design. I have a cartoon I like to show audiences from a comic strip called The Far Side, and it shows this group of jungle explorers out in the jungle. And the lead explorer has been strung up with a vine around his ankle, and these wooden stakes on a spring kind of come up and skewer him, and one explorer turns to the other and says, "That's why I never walk in front." And but I show it, and when I show it, audiences immediately recognize that the trap was designed, even though it's made of natural materials, even though it's out in the jungle and so on. And I ask them, is your conclusion that it's designed, is that based on your religious beliefs? Is it a philosophical conclusion? And of course it's not. It's just these guys trooping through the jungle. And it shows that, we come to conclusions of design all the time, and has nothing to do with religious positions. It's our experience, our experience with the everyday physical world.
And we do this all the time. Like if I see a note post on the refrigerator that says, "Honey, I'll be back in an hour," I infer that this didn't happen by chance forces. But all of our background knowledge, right, Michael? All of our background knowledge, when we see parts that are ordered for an end or purpose, and we know the causal history of those things, we know that intelligent agency is the reason for these sorts of things. And we do this all the time, not in just common sense examples, but we have like whole fields of study, professional fields of study that are devoted to this. I'm thinking, for example, of things like insurance fraud investigation and things of this sort, arson investigation. Correct?
Absolutely. That's correct. Was it an accident, or did somebody do this on purpose to get the money? Or forensics, criminology. Was somebody's death an accident, or did somebody poison somebody, or set them up to have an accident?
Sure. So we do this all the time, right? We're inferring design and common sense examples. We've got whole industries devoted to this. But now, Michael, why do some people say we have to stop that? We're not allowed now to use design as an explanation when we look at nature, even though, doggone it, we do it everywhere else, and we're perfectly reasonable in doing so. Now when I look at the bacterial flagellum or something else, you're not allowed to even consider that as an option now. Why is that?
Well, frankly, it's sociological reasons much more than, or not scientific reasons.
Mm-hmm.
That's just the way we think these days, and people have gotten the idea that somehow religion and science are opposed to each other, and there's a lot of, unfortunately, a number of people in the scientific community who are vocal and evangelical atheists, and they want to keep any hint of purpose out of nature. But if you look in the history of science, the types of things that science contains, the type of explanations that are allowed, have changed a lot over the years. For example, back in Isaac Newton's day, you weren't allowed to say that two objects affected each other over a distance, as he did with gravity. He said the moon and the earth attract each other, and that sounded pretty mystical to people of his days. They thought you had to bump up against each other to physically affect it, and that sounded like spooky Aristotelian to them. And in the early part of the 20th century, when the Big Bang Theory was first proposed, a lot of physicists were downright, livid over it, because they thought that the universe, by definition, had to be eternal and unchanging, and that it was unscientific to propose a non-eternal, a universe that had a beginning.
So what you're saying is, I think, that what's happening here in these examples and in our day is that what you're getting is these sort of philosophical assumptions that are being kind of brought in and just, I guess, assumed to be true, and they're being assumed, and they're being kind of smuggled in as quote unquote a part of science. Right. But they're not really. It's just a philosophical assumption being brought in. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. The philosophical assumption that the universe has to be eternal would have, inhibited science from investigating the Big Bang Theory. The assumption that two bodies can only interact if they touch each other would have stopped Isaac Newton's theory of gravity. Science, in my view, should just look to the evidence, and the heck with philosophical rules. We just try to explain things the best we can. But especially these days, anything that hints of transcendence, something beyond nature, at least if it's a personal thing, it's forbidden. His physicists have proposed really a lot of weird things, like infinite numbers of universes and things like that.
Right.
And that seems to pass muster. But once you say, well, maybe there's something beyond the universe, and maybe it can make choices and it's intelligent and so on, then you get into trouble.
Now, you mentioned a while ago about the vocal evangelical atheist. Well, speaking of that, atheist Richard Dawkins, who's been called, I think, something like the world's most famous atheist, for whatever that's worth, he said that Darwin made it intellectually respectable to be an atheist. That Darwinism somehow, like before that, it wasn't really intellectually respectable to be an atheist. But now that we've got that, now that somehow it is, do you have any comments on that? What do you think about that?
Well, number one, it shows you why there's such strong pressure to keep Darwin in biology, even though his theory certainly explains some things, but a lot of people think it doesn't explain all of biology. If you're questioning a theory that some people need to make their beliefs intellectually respectable, then they're going to get real upset if you try to argue against it. Mm-hmm. I understand what Dawkins was trying to say, that there was this huge gap in the atheists' understanding of the world. How did life get to be where it was? And Christians and religious believers thought that God made life, but the poor atheists before Darwin, had nothing to say. But now Dawkins thinks that they do. Well, that's fine. I'm not a philosopher or anything, but nonetheless, common theories go in science, and Darwin's theory these days is looking a lot less secure than it did. And the problem for folks like Richard Dawkins is to leave behind their philosophical prejudices and let the evidence speak for itself.
Well, what would you say to people in our audience, just the average Joe in our audience who, again, doesn't have a Ph.D. in biochemistry, doesn't have a Ph.D. in philosophy, just the average guy who's at work or whatever, and he hears things like this? He's got his this guy at work who reads Dawkins' books, let's say, and he comes at him with things like they would say this, something like, well, we know that evolution has been proven, and therefore there is no reason to think that God exists because we have this naturalistic explanation. So what can you say to this average guy to kind of help him out? How might he respond to such a claim that evolution has been proven and therefore we don't need God?
Well, you can say a lot of things to that. I guess number one, if we know that we are more than biological entities. We know we have minds and so on. And even if evolution is true, even if Darwinian evolution is true, the mind itself, I think, disproves the materialistic account. But I'm not a philosopher. That's your job there. But another thing is, existence itself. Why does the universe exist? Why does anything exist? And science might describe how the universe unfolded, but still has no explanation for how it existed, how it came into existence. But the third thing is that Dawkins is talking through his hat. There's good evidence for what events happened in life. That is, in the beginning there were simple creatures, single-celled creatures, and then more complex creatures and so on. So that the history of life seems to be of different organisms succeeding other ones. But nobody has the foggiest idea how that happened. Some think they do. Some think that Darwin's theory explains it. But just as I found out when I tried to look for explanations for biochemical systems, if you look for real explanations other than, kind of smug, self-assured rhetoric, you won't find them in the scientific literature. Complex things like the bacterial flagellum or other things. If you ask the question, can random mutations, random changes in DNA, plus natural selection, build anything remotely like these complex systems? And if you look in the literature, the answer is clearly no.
Wow. All right. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say what's more, that if you look at many evolution experiments, as I kind of talk about in my books, in fact, not only don't you see them building complex things, you see them degrading systems they already have. Turns out that one way that you can have a beneficial mutation is by getting rid of equipment that you do not need, cellular equipment. It's kind of like being in a sinking ship. And what can you do to stop yourself from sinking? One thing you can do is kind of throw over heavy equipment, sophisticated equipment, and that'll keep you afloat a little bit longer. Experiments have shown bacteria and other organisms improving or surviving by getting rid of, degrading complex systems that they already had.
Simplifying, in other words, to live.
Exactly, that's right. Stripping down,
yeah.
And that's interesting, and it's useful, but it just shows you that they do not build new complex systems.
Yeah.
Throwing away stuff is not the opposite of building stuff.
Interesting. Well, help me understand this better, Michael, because I'm not a biologist, I'm not a biochemist, I'm a philosopher and a logician. I like to kind of categorize and define things. But when I hear people say that evolution, well, quote unquote evolution is proven, I find that they mean different things by that term evolution, about what they mean by such and such evolution, that is proven. I think a lot of times what they mean by that is kind of what I call an evolution light, a very obvious form of evolution, meaning, for example, say descent with modification. We know this happens, right? This is obvious. We know that genetic mutation, natural selection, we know that insects can develop resistance to pesticides, right? Bacteria can develop resistance to antibiotics. So yeah, if that's what you mean by quote unquote evolution, that certainly has been proven, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing you have to do when you're talking about this subject is to define what you mean by evolution. Evolution in the sense of common descent is, it's very interesting, but it certainly doesn't have the philosophical implications that, say, Richard Dawkins wants in Darwinism.
Yes.
After all, God might have, set the world up in order for life to evolve, but he directed it, or he put the information in it to allow it to do so. Darwin's claim, actually, there were people before Darwin who had proposed things like evolution. So his claim to fame wasn't just to propose common descent. His claim to fame was that he proposed a completely naturalistic account, that evolution could occur unguided or undirected by anyone at all, pointedly including God. And that is the aspect of evolution, or what comes under the rubric of evolution, that is continues to be exceedingly speculative. And if you read my books,
right.
utterly against the evidence we have.
So we could, is it safe to say this, that quote unquote evolution, meaning descent with modification, that's been proven? Maybe you could even add into that not just descent with modification, but also common descent, right? That all living things have a common ancestor, perhaps. You might add that in, but still, that doesn't get you to what Dawkins is saying. You would need some sort of third element, such as not just descent with modification, not just common descent, but this additional thing saying something like Yeah, and no intelligent guidance was needed for this process. You see?
Yeah, exactly. It's the question of why or how did this happen? What caused it to happen? And that was the big question mark. And actually, if you look at books published even by mainstream biologists today, all of them doubt evolution or Darwin's mechanism. Mainstream biologists are casting around for something else. They're staying way far away from intelligent design. But it's clear that a lot of the biological community realizes that Darwin's theory is not a good account for the why or the because or the mechanism of evolution.
Yeah, so you could say that scientific evidence supports that evolution happened, perhaps, but it doesn't say how it happened, how it came about, and so on. In a complete explanation, let's say.
That's right, and not only doesn't it, I don't want to just say it's negative, but again, as I explain in a lot more detail in my books, it's against the evidence. Darwin's theory is against the evidence, and that there's strong positive reasons for thinking that these sophisticated and elegant systems of life needed intelligent design. So I think we're living in a good time if for people who can get past the propaganda that's put out routinely. The actual facts show us spectacular, intelligent, sophisticated systems at the very foundation of life. And so if you recall the verse that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, it gives you a brand new appreciation for that.
All right, so what do you think, you've been in this debate a long time, you've seen a lot, what do you think is the biggest mistake that you see other Christians and believers making when it comes to the debate over evolution and design?
Well, I think it's to confuse the issue of common descent with intelligent design. It's been my experience that Darwinists and everybody on that side will be happy to talk with you the whole day about whether organisms look like they're related, and there's lots of evidence that they can point to say that that they are, but they really hate to talk about the question of, well, how would a random process, even when connected with natural selection, how could that build something like a heart? Or how could it build the bacterial flagellum step by tiny step? So the mistake that I think is made is when people focus on what I'd call the history of evolution and not on the cause. What is causing this to happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been my experience too, actually. Well, look, you've been studying this for a long time. If you had to kind of, I know this is probably going to be a difficult question, but if you had to say, what would you say is the most important thing you've learned about this whole Darwinian evolution sort of debate?
Well, I guess the thing is not really about the science. I came into this with wondering about evolution, and my confidence in design has only grown much, much stronger in the intervening time.
Okay.
It's just about the difficulty of communicating with people.
Oh, that was my next question. So yeah. Perfect.
that some people have a point of view and they don't hear what you're saying and they won't listen to you, and even some of your friends, get things confused here. And so you might have the bestest idea in the whole world, but letting other people in on it is, especially if it's controversial, is a very difficult enterprise.
Interesting. Well, look, I want to tell a quick story that I heard about you, and it's a good story about you, but I know you never say it because you're way too humble. But a friend of mine at BC said you came and gave a presentation, and he said that there were I don't know if it was a panel or what, a biologist who disagreed with you, and he said they grilled you for a long time, but he told me at the end, Scott, they couldn't lay a glove on Michael Behe.
Well, tell me who that is. I'd like to send him $5.
All right. Well, look, what's the least? Let me ask you this. This is a related question. What's the least favorite part of doing what you do? Because I see that, Lehigh University has this statement, Michael Behe speaks for himself. He doesn't speak for all of us. That's got to be frustrating, because, Michael, you're going against the grain, I mean, you're going against the common dogma, if I may say that, if I may use that word, because I do think that's what it is. But you are cutting against the grain of the mainstream thought in biology and so on. What's the least favorite part of doing what you do?
Well, yeah, as you might expect, it's no fun when this is an emotional issue for many people, and so a lot of people will denounce you or say that you have bad breath or something like that, and that it's always unpleasant to hear. But that's just the flip side of another. The good thing, and that is, this is an exciting issue, and it's an important issue, and heck, I can talk, and it's an easy issue too. It's not hard to see the design, and so I get to be talking about what I really like and pushing for an important issue, and after all, who wants to spend their whole life just being patted on the back and told that you're nice and going along with the flow and not making a difference.
All right, you got a lot of nice things to say there. Where can our listeners now go if they're interested in this topic? Where can our listeners go to find out more about you?
Well, I would I don't have my own personal website, but I would recommend people go to a place called Evolution News and Views. It's a blog that's maintained by something called the Discovery Institute, which is a think tank which has a component devoted to promoting intelligent design, and there's a lot of articles on file and a lot of comments on news of the day and concerning evolution and so on, and that's again the site is called Evolution News and Views. So just Google it, and they'll be able to find it and get all the information that they'd like to have.
Sure. Hey, Michael, this has been great. I really want to thank you for coming on and sharing your views. I want to recommend to the audience, too, please check out Michael's book, Darwin's Black Box. If I can read it and get something valuable out of it, you can, too. It's not a difficult read, and it really does, I think, get to the heart of this issue. So, Michael, hey, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
That's all we have time for today, folks. This is Scott Sullivan. Visit us on the web at www.scottmsullivan.com, where I have some more resources for you regarding Christian faith and apologetics, theology, and things of that nature. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. You can do that there on iTunes, or you can do it on your Droid device. Any device you have, you can subscribe to our podcast. That way you'll be notified when the next one comes out. I look forward to talking to you in the next episode of Spiritual Combat.
In your face with grace. You've been listening to Spiritual Combat with Dr. Scott Sullivan. www.scottmsullivan.com